when Hitler realized that America was built different. That moment stands as one of history's most consequential miscalculations. A decision made in the haze of early victories, in the intoxicating rush of seemingly unstoppable conquest that would ultimately seal the fate of Nazi Germany. This is the story of how Adolf Hitler fundamentally misunderstood the sleeping giant he awakened, and how that mistake changed the course of human history forever. December 7th, 1941. As Japanese carrier planes swept over Pearl Harbor in the early morning hours, Hitler was thousands of miles away at his Wolf's Lair headquarters in East Prussia. The attack came as a complete surprise to him. Japan had not informed their German allies beforehand, though the Japanese ambassador had hinted that hostilities with America were imminent. When the news reached Hitler that evening, witnesses say he was ecstatic. The head of the German High Command, Wilhelm Keitel, would later recall it was the only time during the entire war he saw Hitler burst into a room with excitement. Hitler felt, as Keitel remembered, as if freed from a heavy load. To understand why Hitler celebrated what should have terrified him, we need to step back and examine his view of America and the context of that fateful December. By late 1941, Hitler's war had reached a critical juncture. Operation Barbarossa, the massive invasion of the Soviet Union launched in June, had stalled catastrophically. German forces, promised a quick summer victory, found themselves within sight of Moscow's domes, just 5 miles from the Kremlin, but could advance no further. The temperature had plunged to 30 degrees below zero. German soldiers lacked winter clothing. Their tanks and trucks sat immobilized by snow and motor oil that had thickened to the consistency of caramel. On December 6th, just one day before Pearl Harbor, Soviet forces launched a massive counterattack that would eventually save Moscow and doom Hitler's dream of a swift Eastern victory. It was against this grim backdrop that news of Pearl Harbor arrived. Hitler saw it as a lifeline. He believed the Japanese attack would divert British and American resources away from Europe. He thought it would keep America bogged down in the Pacific, while Germany finished its business with the Soviet Union. He was, in every meaningful way, catastrophically wrong. But Hitler's reaction reveals something deeper than mere tactical miscalculation. It exposes his fundamental misunderstanding of what America was and what it could become when provoked. To Hitler, America was a decayed country. He would later say this explicitly. He saw American society as racially mixed, culturally fragmented, dominated by what he called Jewish and black influences, lacking the authoritarian discipline necessary for modern warfare. In his warped racial ideology, how could such a nation possibly hold together, let alone fight effectively? He viewed the United States as a decadent democracy, soft from years of peace and prosperity, led by politicians who would crumble under military pressure. Hitler's top lieutenants shared these delusions. Hermann Göring, head of the Luftwaffe, famously dismissed American industrial capacity, claiming Americans could only make refrigerators and razor blades. They would never be able to produce serious military equipment, he insisted. These were not idle boasts made for propaganda purposes. These men genuinely believed what they were saying. Hitler's ideology, built on twisted racial hierarchies, had blinded him to reality. He could not conceive that a diverse democracy might possess strengths that a totalitarian state lacked. The numbers tell a different story entirely. In 1939, when the war in Europe began, the United States had the world's largest economy. American national income was nearly double the combined national incomes of Germany, Japan, and Italy together. America produced more steel than Germany. It mined almost double the amount of coal. These were not mere statistics. They represented the foundation of modern industrial warfare, and America possessed them in abundance. But Hitler dismissed these figures. In May 1940, President Franklin Roosevelt called for the production of 185,000 aircraft, 120,000 tanks, 55,000 anti-aircraft guns, and 18 million tons of merchant shipping within 2 years. Hitler's advisors told him this was American propaganda, that such production was impossible. After all, in 1939, annual aircraft production for the U.S. military was less than 3,000 planes. How could a nation go from producing 3,000 planes to 185,000 in just a few years? It seemed absurd. It was not absurd. It was America. By the end of the war, American factories had produced over 300,000 aircraft. By 1904 alone, they had manufactured two-thirds of all Allied military equipment used in the war. The scale of this transformation was unprecedented in human history. America did not just meet Roosevelt's goals, it exceeded them beyond anyone's imagination, except perhaps Roosevelt's own. But in December 1941, as Hitler stood at his headquarters celebrating the Japanese attack, he did not know this yet. He had another reason to feel optimistic, or so he thought. Hitler believed war with America was inevitable anyway. For over a year, the United States had been providing massive material support to Britain through the Lend-Lease Act. Passed in March 1941, this legislation allowed Roosevelt to lend or lease war materials to any country whose defense he deemed vital to the United States. Britain, which had been paying cash for American supplies, was running out of money by late 1940. Prime Minister Winston Churchill had liquidated much of Britain's overseas holdings. The gold reserves were depleting rapidly. Lend-Lease was a lifeline. To Hitler, this made America a belligerent in all but name. American destroyers were escorting convoys across the Atlantic. American ships were being attacked by German U-boats. Incidents had occurred where U-boats sank American vessels. Roosevelt was providing billions of dollars in aid to Britain, and would soon extend that aid to the Soviet Union. In Hitler's mind, a formal declaration of war would simply make official what was already happening in practice. Better to strike first, to seize the initiative, to unleash the U-boats without restriction. On December 11, 1941, 4 days after Pearl Harbor, Hitler made his move. Standing before the Reichstag in the Kroll Opera House in Berlin, he delivered a 90-minute speech declaring war on the United States. It was a rambling, vitriolic address. Much of it focused on attacking President Roosevelt personally. Hitler called him a failed political leader, a warmonger, a hypocrite, a puppet of Jews and plutocrats. He blamed Roosevelt for the war. He claimed Roosevelt wanted war to cover up the failures of the New Deal. He accused the president of inciting conflict, falsifying causes, wrapping himself in Christian hypocrisy while leading mankind to war. The speech revealed Hitler's grandiose self-image. He stated he could only be grateful to Providence for entrusting him with leadership in this historic struggle which, for the next 500 or 1,000 years, would be described as decisive not only for German history, but for all of Europe. He saw himself as a figure of world historical importance, a man making decisions that would echo through the ages. He was right about that, but not in the way he imagined. When German Foreign Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop met with American chargé d'affaires Leland Morris to formally deliver the declaration, he was theatrical and angry. According to diplomat George Kennan, who worked with Morris, after reading the declaration, Ribbentrop screamed at Morris that Roosevelt had wanted this war, and now he had it, then turned on his heels and stormed out. In Washington, Secretary of State Cordell Hull refused to even see the German delegation. When they arrived with their copy of the declaration, they had to hand it to a lower-ranking official. Roosevelt's response was remarkably understated. After Germany's decision reached Washington, he sent a brief written message to Congress asking for a declaration of war against Germany and Italy, which had also declared war on America. There was no dramatic speech to a joint session of Congress like the one following Pearl Harbor. The message was simple, businesslike, matter of fact. Congress voted overwhelmingly in favor. America was now officially at war on two fronts, in both Europe and the Pacific. Historians have spent decades trying to understand why Hitler made this decision. He was not required by treaty to do so. The tripartite pact with Japan and Italy obligated Germany to support Japan only if Japan was attacked, not if Japan was the aggressor. Japan had struck first at Pearl Harbor. Hitler had no legal obligation to follow suit. Yet he did, and he did so eagerly, without consulting his military planners, without giving Admiral Dönitz advance notice, so U-boats could be positioned to take advantage, without any coherent strategy for how to actually fight America. Multiple factors contributed to this decision, but they all trace back to Hitler's fundamental miscalculation about American capability and will. He underestimated American industrial power. He underestimated the psychological impact his declaration would have on American public opinion. Before December 11th, there remained significant isolationist sentiment in the United States. Many Americans wanted to focus entirely on Japan and avoid deeper involvement in Europe. Hitler's declaration eliminated that possibility. It unified the country. It gave Roosevelt exactly what he needed. As Winston Churchill would later say, when he heard the news of Hitler's declaration, he went to bed and slept the sleep of the saved and thankful. He knew Britain now had the most powerful ally possible. But at the moment of his decision, Hitler could not see what was coming. He believed Japan was much stronger than it actually was. He thought once Japan defeated the United States in the Pacific, it would turn and help Germany defeat the Soviet Union. This fantasy had no basis in reality. He believed the war in Europe would be decided quickly, before American industrial might could be fully mobilized. He thought Germany would defeat the Soviet Union in the spring of 1942 when the weather improved, freeing up resources to deal with whatever America might send across the Atlantic. Every one of these assumptions was wrong. What Hitler failed to grasp was the sheer scale of American industrial capacity and its ability to expand rapidly. The United States in 1940 had a military ranking 18th largest in the world, after Romania. It had approximately 630,000 soldiers, compared to over 4 million each for Germany and Japan. This looked reassuring to Hitler. What he did not understand was that America's small military was not a sign of weakness, but of choice. The nation had deliberately kept its military small during peacetime. But the industrial base, the factories, the machine tools, the engineering expertise, the organizational capacity, all of that existed in abundance, waiting to be activated. When Roosevelt began mobilizing American industry in 1940, even before Pearl Harbor, the transformation began. He recruited William Knudsen, president of General Motors, to lead the effort. Knudsen was a Danish immigrant who had worked his way up from dock worker to become one of America's most skilled industrial managers. He knew mass production. He knew how to build complex machines quickly and efficiently. Knudsen assembled a team of industrialists and began the massive task of converting American factories from peacetime to wartime production. Companies already engaged in defense work expanded dramatically. Others switched from producing consumer goods to making war equipment. Factories that had made silk ribbons now produced parachutes. Automobile plants built tanks. Typewriter companies converted to rifle production. Undergarment manufacturers sewed mosquito netting. A roller coaster manufacturer started making bomber repair platforms. The scale of this conversion was staggering. Consider the numbers. Tank production alone went from 331 units in 1940 to 29,097 in 1943. That single year of production exceeded Germany's entire tank production from 1939 to 1945. Overall, the United States manufactured 88,430 tanks during the war versus 2,400 in Britain and 2,450 in Germany. American factories produced 297,000 aircraft, 193,000 artillery pieces, and 2 million Army trucks. American industry provided almost 2/3 of all Allied military equipment produced during the war. The aircraft industry transformed. In 1940, Boeing produced about 60 planes per month. By March 1904, production had increased to 362 planes monthly. In Roosevelt's May 1940 call for 50,000 planes, critics had ridiculed the goal as impossible. By 1904, American plants were producing nearly 100,000 planes annually. The wartime total exceeded 300,000 aircraft, more than the production of Britain and the Soviet Union combined. In 1904 alone, the United States built more planes than Japan produced during the entire war from 1939 to 1945. Shipbuilding followed the same pattern. America launched more vessels in 1941 than Japan built during the entire war. Shipyards turned out tonnage so fast that by autumn 1943, all Allied shipping sunk since 1939 had been replaced. Henry Kaiser revolutionized shipbuilding with innovative subassembly techniques. His yards produced Liberty ships, the cargo vessels that would ferry supplies across the oceans, at unprecedented speed. What once took months now took weeks and eventually days. By the end of the war, more than half of all industrial production in the world took place in the United States. In 4 years, American industrial production, already the world's largest, doubled in size. This was the production miracle that Hitler and Goering had dismissed as impossible. This was the arsenal of democracy that Roosevelt had promised. But production was only part of the equation. Raw materials mattered. The United States had vast natural resources within its borders or easily accessible through trade. Germany, by contrast, depended on resources outside its control. As the war progressed and Germany lost territories, access to crucial materials became increasingly difficult. American access to rubber, oil, metals, and other essentials never faced serious threat. The industrial machine could run at full capacity. The human element cannot be ignored either. America mobilized its workforce in unprecedented ways. Women entered factories in massive numbers, taking on jobs previously reserved for men. The iconic image of Rosie the Riveter represented this transformation. Before the war, society generally expected women to focus on homemaking and child-rearing. The war changed that. Women became welders, riveters, machinists, doing heavy industrial work that sustained the war effort. African Americans and Latinos also filled critical manufacturing roles, breaking down some long-standing barriers even as discrimination persisted. The economic statistics are equally striking. During the Great Depression, unemployment had reached 25%. By late 1943, unemployment had fallen to an incredible 1.3%. Over 15 million Americans entered the workforce, or military, between 1940 and 1943. The government spent massively. In 1941, before full American entry into the war, government spending represented 30% of GDP. By 1904, at the war's peak, government spending had risen to over 79% of GDP, a 294% increase in 3 years. This level of economic mobilization had never been seen before and has not been seen since. Meanwhile, Hitler's declaration had unleashed the U-boats, and initially they achieved horrifying success. Operation Drumbeat, as the Germans called it, targeted American merchant shipping along the East Coast and in the Gulf of Mexico. In the first 6 months of 1942, German U-boats dominated these waters. The United States was unprepared. Coastal cities refused to black out their lights, worried about tourism and morale. Ships traveling at night were backlit by city lights, making them easy targets. Merchant vessels traveled alone rather than in convoys. Anti-submarine defenses were inadequate. The carnage was immense. In just the first 6 months of the U-boat offensive off the American coast, nearly 400 ships totaling over 2 million tons were sunk, costing roughly 5,000 lives. Only 7 U-boats were lost in the process. The Germans called this period the happy time, or the American shooting season. U-boat commanders described it as almost too easy. One commander, approaching the brightly lit American coast, felt the task before him was handed on a plate. Ships silhouetted against city lights were, as a German report stated, sitting ducks. The American response was slow and often incompetent. Admiral Ernest King, who commanded American naval forces, resisted implementing convoy systems despite British urgings. He believed scattered ships made poorer targets than grouped convoys. This was precisely wrong, as the British had learned years earlier. Ships traveling alone were picked off one by one. It was not until mid-May 1942 that America finally started running convoys on the East Coast, over 4 months too late. Once convoys began, they proved effective immediately, just as the British had known they would. By summer 1942, America had started taking the U-boat threat seriously. Coastal blackouts were imposed, though never fully effectively. More importantly, anti-submarine patrols increased. Convoy systems expanded. Naval vessels received better training and equipment. By August 1942, the German happy time had ended. The U-boats were forced to retreat to deeper ocean waters, where Allied defenses were better organized. The U-boat campaign, despite its early successes, could not stop what was coming. America's industrial output kept growing. The flow of supplies to Britain and the Soviet Union increased month after month. By the end of the war, the United States had provided over $50 billion in Lend-Lease aid to 38 Allied countries. The largest recipients were Britain at $31 billion and the Soviet Union at $11 billion. This aid was provided at no immediate cost to the receiving nations, to be repaid not in money but in joint action, directed toward creating a liberalized international economic order after the war. It was an investment in victory and in the post-war world America envisioned. Soviet leader Joseph Stalin, who had received massive American aid including trucks, food, aircraft, and raw materials, acknowledged this at the Tehran Conference in 1943. Without American production, he admitted, the Allies could never have won the war. This from the leader of a nation that had sacrificed more than any other in terms of human life and suffered unimaginable devastation. The Soviet Union bore the brunt of the fighting in Europe, but American production made that fight sustainable. Hitler began to realize his error, though he could never fully acknowledge it. As American troops, equipment, and supplies poured into Britain throughout 1942 and 1943, the possibility of an Allied invasion of Western Europe became increasingly real. The Germans knew it was coming. They just did not know where or when. Hitler ordered the construction of the Atlantic Wall, a massive system of coastal fortifications stretching from Norway to Spain. Over 100 batteries were planned and constructed. Networks of roads and railways were built. Millions of mines were laid. Obstacles filled the beaches. The fortifications were formidable, but they could not hold back what America and its allies were preparing. By May 1904, over 2.8 million Allied troops were massed in southern England. The largest armada in history lay in wait. More than 1,200 planes stood ready. The planning for Operation Overlord, the invasion of Normandy, had been years in the making. General Dwight Eisenhower, appointed Supreme Allied Commander, oversaw the coordinated efforts of 12 nations. Every detail had been considered: where to land, how many troops, what equipment each soldier would carry, how to keep it secret from the enemy, how to deceive Hitler about the actual target. The deception worked brilliantly. Operation Fortitude convinced German High Command that the invasion would come at Pas de Calais, the narrowest part of the English Channel. Hitler kept substantial forces there even after the Normandy landings began, convinced the Normandy attack was a feint. This mistake proved costly. The lack of immediate reinforcements to Normandy allowed the Allies to establish their beachhead. On June 6, 1904, nearly 160,000 Allied troops landed along a 50-mile stretch of heavily fortified French coastline. The assault combined airborne operations, with over 23,000 paratroopers dropping behind German lines, and amphibious landings on 5 beaches codenamed Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword. American forces took Utah and Omaha. British and Canadian forces landed on the other 3. Omaha Beach saw the fiercest resistance and highest casualties, but by day's end, all 5 beaches were secured. The scale of D-Day was unprecedented. Over 5,000 ships and landing craft participated. Naval vessels bombarded German positions. Aircraft struck enemy defenses. Within 48 hours of the initial assault, over 130,000 troops and 17,000 vehicles came ashore. By the end of June, more than 850,000 men and 150,000 vehicles had landed in Normandy. The flow of supplies continued daily, a testament to American logistical capability. By August, all of northern France was liberated. Paris was freed. The Allied forces reorganized for the drive into Germany. The Normandy invasion marked the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany. It opened the Western Front that Hitler had dreaded. Now Germany faced a two-front war in earnest. Soviet forces advanced from the east. American, British, and Canadian forces pushed from the west. The industrial might of America, the manpower of the Soviet Union, and the determination of Britain combined to create an unstoppable force. Germany's situation grew increasingly desperate. American aircraft dominated the skies. Allied bombers pounded German cities and industrial centers. Supply lines were cut. Oil production facilities were destroyed. The German military struggled to replace losses. By 1904, Germany was outnumbered and outproduced in every category that mattered. American factories were producing twice as many aircraft as Germany. Tank production vastly exceeded German capability. Fuel shortages crippled German operations while American forces had reliable supply lines. The contrast with Hitler's early expectations could not have been starker. He had assumed American society was too weak, too divided, too focused on consumer comforts to wage effective war. He found instead a nation that transformed itself with remarkable speed and efficiency. He had assumed American democracy was a weakness. He discovered it was a source of strength. Free societies, it turned out, could mobilize and organize with effectiveness that matched or exceeded totalitarian states. And they could do so while maintaining the flexibility and innovation that rigid ideological systems stifled. Hitler had assumed racial diversity was a fatal flaw. He learned that a nation drawing talent from every background could harness human potential more effectively than one obsessed with racial purity. American forces included soldiers of every ethnicity. African American troops served with distinction despite facing discrimination at home. Japanese American soldiers, some from families held in internment camps, fought with extraordinary valor in Europe. The diversity Hitler mocked became a source of strength. The assumption that America lacked martial spirit proved equally wrong. Americans, given a clear cause and motivated by genuine threat, fought with determination and skill. The myth of the soft American crumbled in the hedgerows of Normandy, the mountains of Italy, the islands of the Pacific. American troops, often derided by German propaganda as inferior soldiers, proved their worth in battle after battle. By early 1945, Allied forces were advancing into Germany from both east and west. The war that Hitler thought would be decided quickly in Germany's favor had turned into a grinding, catastrophic defeat. German cities lay in ruins. Millions of German soldiers were dead or captured. The civilian population faced starvation and devastation. The industrial capacity that had seemed so mighty in 1939 had been systematically destroyed by Allied bombing and captured by advancing ground forces. On April 30th, 1945, as Soviet forces closed in on Berlin, Hitler committed suicide in his bunker beneath the ruins of the city. He left behind a devastated nation, a continent in ruins, and a historical legacy of unprecedented evil. Just over a week later, on May 8th, 1945, Germany surrendered unconditionally. The war in Europe was over. Hitler's decision to declare war on the United States on December 11, 1941, was, as historians have noted, his most puzzling decision of World War II. It was also among his most disastrous. By bringing America fully into the European war, he guaranteed Germany's defeat. The industrial might, the economic resources, the human capital that America brought to the conflict made Allied victory not just possible, but inevitable. The only questions were how long it would take and how much it would cost. The numbers tell the full story. Germany produced roughly 1,000 aircraft during the entire war. America produced 300,000. Germany built about 24,000 tanks. America built 88,000. Germany's GDP in 1904 was overwhelmed by the combined Allied economies, with America contributing the lion's share. The war became a contest of industrial production and economic endurance, and Germany had no chance of winning that contest once America entered fully. Hitler's fundamental error was ideological. His racist worldview prevented him from accurately assessing American society and capability. He saw what he wanted to see. What his ideology told him must be true, rather than objective reality. He convinced himself that a diverse democracy could not fight effectively. He convinced himself that Americans were soft and weak. He convinced himself that American industrial capacity was exaggerated or irrelevant. Every one of these convictions was wrong, and everyone contributed to Germany's defeat. The story of Hitler's miscalculation about America is ultimately a story about the danger of ideology over reality, of prejudice over assessment, of wishful thinking over hard facts. It shows how a leader, even one with significant early success, can make catastrophic errors when ideology clouds judgment. Hitler achieved stunning victories in the war's early years. He conquered most of Europe. He created a vast empire, but he did so through a combination of military innovation, bold tactics, and opponents who were unprepared or unwilling to fight. Once he faced an enemy that combined industrial might with determined will, his system's weaknesses became fatal. The United States was built different, though not in the way nationalistic mythology sometimes suggests. What made America formidable was not some inherent superiority of its people, but the combination of vast resources, technological capability, industrial organization, and a political system that, despite its flaws and contradictions, could mobilize effectively when facing existential threat. The diversity Hitler mocked allowed America to draw on a larger pool of talent and perspectives. The democracy he dismissed as weak provided legitimacy and motivation that totalitarianism could not match. The consumer culture he derided had created the industrial infrastructure that converted rapidly to war production. When Hitler declared war on America, he thought he was acting from a position of strength. He thought he was seizing the initiative. He thought he was managing threats on his own terms. In reality, he was sealing his own fate and that of Nazi Germany. The sleeping giant he awakened would not just fight, it would overwhelm. It would outproduce, outorganize, and outlast the Reich that Hitler boasted would last 1,000 years. That Reich lasted 12 years, from 1933 to 1945, and its end came in large part because Hitler fatally misjudged the nation he declared war on in December 1941. The lessons echo through history. Underestimating opponents is always dangerous. Allowing ideology to cloud assessment of reality is fatal. Assuming that early success guarantees eventual victory ignores the capacity of societies to adapt, mobilize, and overcome initial setbacks. Hitler learned these lessons, but far too late, in a bunker beneath a ruined city, as the consequences of his miscalculation closed in from all sides. America's role in World War II was enabled by the Industrial Revolution that had transformed the nation in the decades before the war. It was made possible by the choice to build not just a military, but a massive industrial base capable of supporting prolonged conflict. It was achieved through the contributions of millions of people from every background, working in factories, serving in uniform, supporting the effort in countless ways. The production miracle that Hitler dismissed as propaganda became the material foundation of Allied victory. This is not a story of American perfection. The United States had and has profound flaws. Racial discrimination persisted during the war and after. Japanese Americans were interned in camps while their sons fought for the nation that imprisoned their families. African Americans served in segregated units and returned home to face continued racism. The victory over fascism abroad did not immediately translate to justice at home. These contradictions and failures are part of the historical record. But in the specific context of World War II, Hitler's miscalculation about American capability was total and absolute. He thought America weak. It proved strong. He thought American production exaggerated. It exceeded even optimistic predictions. He thought American society would fracture under pressure. It unified. He thought democracy inferior to authoritarianism. History proved otherwise. In making war on America, Hitler guaranteed that his regime would face an opponent it could not defeat, with resources it could not match, fighting for a cause that provided moral clarity and motivation. When Hitler realized that America was built different, it was too late to change course. The declarations had been made, the war was engaged, the industrial mobilization was underway. All that remained was for history to play out its inevitable conclusion. The 1,000-year Reich would fall. The dictator would die in ignominy. The nations he sought to dominate would be liberated. And the industrial might of America, combined with the sacrifice of millions from all Allied nations, would ensure that fascism's bid for global domination ended in total defeat. This is the story of how one man's ideological blindness led to strategic catastrophe, how a nation dismissed as weak became the arsenal of democracy, how underestimation turned into overwhelming defeat, how Hitler, in the moment he thought he was acting decisively, made the decision that would doom everything he had built. December 11th, 1941, the day Hitler declared war on America, was the day he sealed Nazi Germany's fate. He just didn't know it yet.